The woods around Coleridge Hollow were the kind that swallowed sound. The trees stood close together, their bark slick with the black dust that never left the soil after the mines went silent. Locals said the hollow was cursed, that no bird sang there, and no man came back the same if he wandered too far. But there was a light that sometimes flickered between the pines, faint and trembling, like a candle caught in the breath of the wind. That was where she lived, Elsie, the girl who was never meant to leave. Coleridge Hollow sat deep in the underbelly of Tennessee's forgotten hills, a place that maps once marked but later abandoned as if ashamed to remember it. The earth there was blackened, not only from the coal seams that once fed entire towns but from the centuries of despair that soaked into its soil. Trees grew thick and crooked, their roots tangled like secrets beneath the ground. The air always seemed heavier there, carrying a faint metallic taste from the dust that never settled. The few who dared to drive through that part of the mountain said their engines sputtered and died for no reason, that radio signals turned to static, and that the woods themselves seemed to lean closer, listening. It was here, in this pocket of land forgotten by time and untouched by mercy, that a family continued to exist long after the world had moved on. Generations of them had lived in the same collapsing cabin, built before the first rail tracks were ever laid. They were miners once, hard men with harder lives, until the mines closed and the town emptied. But the family in the hollow didn't leave. Some said it was stubbornness, others whispered it was something darker, something that bound them to the land like a curse. The neighbors who once traded with them in town noticed that their faces began to change over the years, eyes too close together, jaws set in ways that didn't look right, movements that felt unnatural. Soon, no one visited at all. Roads turned to mud, paths grew over, and Coleridge Hollow was erased from every map that mattered. When night fell, the only light that ever showed was a dim glow through a cracked windowpane, proof that someone, or something, still lived there. The locals down in town called them the ones who stayed, though no one said their names anymore. Children were warned not to go near that stretch of woods, and old-timers who remembered the mine days said the family had turned inward, like the mountain itself folding in on its own rot. Sometimes, hunters passing through claimed they heard voices, a woman humming, a child crying, or footsteps pacing under the forest floor. But no one ever saw more than the glint of light between the trees. Coleridge Hollow became a ghost story, a place whispered about but never visited. Yet the truth was far more disturbing than rumor. Deep within that hollow, hidden from the rest of Tennessee, bloodlines that should have ended generations ago still clung together, sealed tight by fear, isolation, and the belief that no one else in the world was pure enough to belong. Elsie came into the world on a night so cold that the frost crept inside the cabin walls, glistening like tiny shards of glass in the lantern light. Her mother lay on a straw mattress, her face pale and damp with sweat, her breath shallow and uneven. There was no midwife, no doctor, no sound except the faint moan of wind pushing against the wooden walls. Her father, a man hardened by years of mining and solitude, stood beside the bed, his hands trembling not from fear, but from something that looked too much like possession. The baby's first cry was sharp and haunting, echoing through the cabin until it was swallowed by the woods outside. The man didn't flinch. He just stared down at the small, red-faced infant as though he had seen her before in another life. Her mother whispered the name, Elsie, before closing her eyes, her lips parting in a final sigh that slipped into silence. The lantern flickered, and for a moment the room was entirely dark. When the flame steadied again, her father was holding the child, his expression hollow and unreadable. He didn't weep or speak. He simply looked down at her as if she belonged more to him than to the woman lying lifeless beside them. By dawn, the body was buried in a shallow grave behind the cabin, marked only with a rough wooden plank. The ground was too frozen to dig deep, and the men worked in silence, the newborn wrapped in an old blanket strapped to his chest. From that day forward, the child grew up in a house where her name was rarely spoken and her mother's name was never allowed to be heard. The men raised her alone, feeding her stories about how the outside world was filled with sickness, how people there had forgotten what true family meant. He told her that they were special, chosen to carry on a pure line that stretched back before the coal mines, before the war, before the world had lost its way. Sometimes, he would hold her too tightly when he said it, whispering promises that made her heart race with a fear she couldn't yet name. Outside, the forest watched over them like a wall of dark eyes. No one came to the hollow anymore, and no one saw the little girl with pale hair and her father with his coal-stained hands. The hills absorbed their voices, their lives, their sins, until it seemed as though the world itself had agreed to forget that either of them existed. But the woods remember everything, and even as a baby, Elsie seemed to know that the shadows were listening. When Elsie turned 6, the woods took her mother, or that was what her father told her. The story changed each time he spoke it. Sometimes, he said her mother had wandered into the forest and lost her way in the fog. Other times, he claimed she'd grown tired of the world and gone to live among the spirits in the hills. But no one ever saw her leave, and Elsie never remembered hearing the door open that night. The only sound she recalled was the slow creak of the floorboards and the heavy breathing of her father standing in the dark. When morning came, her mother's side of the bed was empty, her clothes gone, her scent already fading from the air. Outside, the ground was undisturbed, the frost unbroken, as if no one had walked through it at all. The neighbors, what few were left scattered miles down the valley, didn't come up to ask questions. They had long stopped visiting the family in the hollow. People whispered that the woman had always looked sickly, that she talked to herself, that she'd been planning to leave for months. No one dared to look for her, because the woods around the cabin were thick with old mine shafts and animal traps, and because those who went searching in that direction sometimes never returned. Within a week, her name was swallowed by silence. Elsie asked where she had gone, but her father's answers grew sharper each time. "She's gone to heaven," he said once. "She's gone home," he said another. Eventually, he just told her to stop asking. After that, things inside the cabin changed. Her father began locking the door every night and covering the windows with nailed boards. He stopped shaving, stopped speaking for days at a time, and when he did talk, his voice carried a strange tenderness that made Elsie's stomach twist. He started calling her by her mother's name without realizing it, or perhaps without caring. The girl's clothes were replaced with her mother's old dresses, and at night, he would hum the same lullaby he once sang to his wife. Elsie would close her eyes and pretend to sleep, too afraid to breathe. The forest outside grew darker, denser, as though it was closing in around them. Sometimes, when she stood by the back door, she thought she saw a shape moving between the trees, a pale figure watching her quietly, almost protectively. She wanted to believe it was her mother, but even as a child, she knew that the woman who had once lived there was buried somewhere near, beneath unmarked earth, waiting for the truth to be uncovered. By the time Elsie was 9, her father had stopped speaking of the outside world altogether. He told her the hills were all that mattered now, that beyond them lay nothing but corruption, sickness, and lies. He said the world had forgotten them on purpose, and that forgetting was a kind of protection. The more she grew, the more he spoke of keeping the family whole. At first, she didn't understand what he meant. He told her stories about their ancestors, how they had built the first cabin in the hollow and promised never to mix their blood with outsiders. "It's what keeps us clean," he said, pressing a calloused hand against her cheek. "What keeps us chosen." He began to teach her strange lessons. Not about reading or numbers, but about loyalty, obedience, and blood. He made her repeat words from the Bible, twisted and bent into his own meanings. "A man must not be alone," he said one night, his voice low, "and a woman must not wander far from her own." He started calling her by her mother's name again, not out of confusion but with intention. When she corrected him, his eyes darkened, and his hand came down hard enough to make her lip bleed. From then on, she stopped correcting him. Each morning, he made her brush her hair the way her mother had, parting it neatly down the middle, and he told her she had her mother's eyes. He began leaving little gifts for her on the table, an old ribbon, a cracked brooch, a dried flower pressed between pages of a moldy book. He said they were keepsakes, reminders of who she was meant to be. She didn't know how to tell him that she didn't want to be anyone's replacement. The house grew quieter as the seasons passed. He boarded up another window, then another, until only slivers of light crept through. When thunder rolled through the hollow, he made her kneel beside him and pray for purity, whispering that God had made them in his image and that no one could take that away. But there was something in his eyes that didn't look holy at all. At night, when she lay awake, she could hear him moving about the house, his heavy steps pausing outside her door. Sometimes, he spoke softly, almost tenderly, as if having a conversation with the woman long buried behind the cabin. And each time he did, Elsie could feel his gaze through the thin wood, the air growing tighter, the walls closing in, until the cabin no longer felt like a home but a shrine built for a sin no one dared to name. When Elsie turned 13, the hollow seemed to grow quieter, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The birds no longer sang near the cabin, and the air carried the constant scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Her father had been distant for weeks, spending long hours in the shed behind the house, hammering and muttering to himself. She sometimes saw him through the cracks in the boards, working on something with the careful focus of a man preparing for a sermon. When she asked what he was building, he told her it was for a special day, a day when their family would finally be whole again. She didn't understand what he meant until the morning she woke to find a white dress laid out at the foot of her bed, the same one her mother had worn in the only photograph that remained in the house. Her father's voice was calm when he spoke, but there was a tremor beneath it, something both reverent and broken. He told her to wash, to braid her hair, to wear the dress. He said it was time she took her mother's place, time she fulfilled what God had intended. She tried to refuse, to tell him she was still a child, but his tone changed from gentle to commanding, and his hand found her shoulder with a grip that left bruises. He said there was no world beyond them now, no law but their blood, no sin in what was destined. The ceremony took place in the main room of the cabin, the windows shuttered tight, the single lantern casting a yellow light that flickered against the walls. He had cleared the table, covered it with a sheet, and placed a worn Bible in the center. There were no witnesses except for the cracked mirror propped against the wall, reflecting their two figures, a man and a trembling girl who could not look away. He spoke words that sounded like scripture but weren't, binding them in a twisted ritual that made her skin crawl. When it was done, he kissed her forehead as if blessing her and whispered that their family was now eternal. That night, Elsie sat alone by the cold hearth, the dress still clinging to her skin, her hands shaking as she tried to scrub away the memory. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, and for the first time, she realized it sounded like her mother's voice. She knew then that whatever her father had done, whatever he had made her part of, was something that could never be undone, and that the hollow would keep their secret the way it always had, quietly, faithfully, forever. It was nearly 2 decades later when the hollow was disturbed again, this time by a stranger who didn't know what kind of silence he was stepping into. His name was Thomas Crane, a government surveyor sent to map out the forgotten mining lands of eastern Tennessee. He was the kind of man who trusted numbers more than stories, someone who believed that every mystery could be solved with the right set of tools. But when his truck rumbled down the narrow dirt path leading toward Coleridge Hollow, his compass needle began to twitch, and the air grew unnaturally still. The deeper he drove, the less the world seemed to follow its rules. The trees grew denser, light dimmed to a gray haze, and even the sound of his engine seemed swallowed by the hills. He didn't find any of the mining ruins listed in his papers, only a single leaning cabin at the end of a half-buried trail. Its roof sagged under the weight of moss, and its windows were covered from the inside with planks and cloth. Thomas cut the engine and stepped out, feeling the thick quiet press against his ears. The place looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about the way the door hung open, as if expecting him. When he walked around the property, he noticed the graves behind the cabin, 2 of them, both marked with weathered wooden planks. The first read simply, Mother. The second bore the same word, carved by a different hand. That was when he realized someone still lived there. The ground near the steps showed signs of movement, small footprints, recent and uneven. He called out, but no voice answered. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees. He stepped inside, careful not to startle whoever might be hiding, but the air inside the cabin was still, thick with the scent of rot and something faintly sweet. Dust coated everything except for one chair near the window, which looked recently used. There were old photographs scattered across the mantel, faces blurred and distorted by time. In one, he thought he saw the same woman twice, once as a young girl and again as a grown woman, though both faces were eerily similar. He left before nightfall, the unease gnawing at him as he walked back to his truck. But as he turned to take one last look at the cabin, he saw the faintest flicker of light inside, and for just a moment, a silhouette standing at the window, small, still, and watching him with eyes that seemed to belong to more than one lifetime. Thomas couldn't shake the image of that small figure watching him from the cabin window. For days after leaving the hollow, his sleep was restless, filled with dreams of flickering lights and a voice whispering through static. He told himself it was just exhaustion, that the isolation of the woods had played tricks on his mind. But the thought of those 2 graves marked Mother lingered like an unanswered question. Finally, driven by curiosity and something darker that he couldn't name, he returned to the cabin a week later, this time carrying a lantern, a camera, and a notebook. The road seemed longer than before, the forest thicker, and the silence heavier. When he reached the clearing, the cabin door was shut, though he was sure he had left it open on his last visit. Inside, the air was colder than he remembered. He moved slowly, his boots crunching against broken glass and rotted wood. The lantern's light danced across the walls, revealing strange carvings, symbols scratched into the beams and doorframes, all in repeating patterns like circles closing in on themselves. He found an old trunk near the bed and pried it open, releasing a puff of dust that smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. Inside were folded clothes, a faded photograph, and a small, leather-bound book tied shut with twine. The cover was stained and warped, but when he opened it, the pages inside were covered in the careful handwriting of a child. The first page was signed Elsie. As he read, the tone of the diary shifted from innocent to haunting. The early pages spoke of her father, how he taught her to pray and told her stories about purity and family. But the entries grew darker as she grew older. She wrote about the nights when she wasn't allowed to sleep, when her father stood outside her door whispering her mother's name. She wrote about wearing the white dress and standing before the mirror while he said words she didn't understand. The final entries were barely legible, written in frantic loops. He says we must stay together. He says she never left. He says I am her now. Thomas's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Near the back of the book were drawings, faces half-formed, some human, some not. In several of them, and I watched from the woods, wide and pale. The last page was smeared with dirt and what looked like blood. The final line read, "They are still here, even when he is gone." That was when Thomas heard a faint sound behind him, a soft, childlike laugh, and saw a shadow slip past the window, moving toward the trees. The first time Thomas saw the child in the woods, it was near dusk, when the sky turned the color of rust and the air hung thick with the smell of wet earth. He had been returning from the hollow for the third time, unable to resist the pull of the mystery that had settled in his mind like a splinter. He had spent the day photographing the graves, sketching the carvings in the cabin, and rereading Elsie's diary until the words seemed to breathe on their own. As he packed his things, a faint movement near the tree line caught his eye, a small figure, half hidden among the pines. It stood perfectly still, watching him. At first, he thought it was just a trick of light, the mind's attempt to give shape to loneliness. But then it moved. The child stepped forward just enough for him to see her face. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with long, pale hair that fell in tangled strands over her shoulders. Her dress was thin and colorless, and her skin looked almost translucent against the dimming light. But what froze Thomas where he stood was her face. It was the same as the girl in the photograph from the cabin mantel, the same girl who had written the diary nearly 50 years earlier. She was identical to Elsie. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The woods were silent, not even the wind daring to stir. Then, as suddenly as she appeared, the child turned and slipped deeper into the forest. Thomas called out, his voice breaking the quiet like a shot, but she didn't respond. He followed, stumbling through the brush, branches clawing at his clothes. He could hear her faint laughter ahead, high and hollow, echoing between the trees. The deeper he went, the darker it became, until his lantern barely cut through the mist. He lost sight of her entirely, and then there it was again, the same sound he had heard on his first visit, a low humming, a woman's voice weaving through the woods like a lullaby. When he finally stopped, panting and disoriented, he found himself standing before what looked like the entrance to an old mine shaft, half collapsed and covered in vines. The humming was louder there, almost beneath his feet. The air coming from the opening was cold, unnaturally so, and it carried a smell that made his stomach tighten. He turned back toward the cabin, heart pounding, but before he reached the clearing, he looked once more over his shoulder and saw her standing at the mouth of the mine, watching him, her eyes wide and glowing faintly in the dying light. The night of the fire began like any other, thick fog rolling down the mountains, the air heavy with the dampness of rain that never quite fell. Thomas had returned once again to the hollow, drawn by a mix of guilt and fascination. He couldn't stop thinking about the child he had seen, the one who wore Elsie's face. He told himself he needed proof, something tangible to explain what he had witnessed. As darkness settled, he sat inside the cabin with only a lantern for company, flipping through the diary's pages. The more he read, the more he realized there were entries written in a different hand, rougher, larger letters that didn't belong to a child. Those entries spoke of redemption through blood, of keeping what was holy beneath the earth, and of a room where sins are buried. He felt an unease claw its way through him, the sense that he was not alone in that house. A sudden noise from outside, like a footstep dragging through wet leaves, made him freeze. The lantern flickered as the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Then came the unmistakable sound of breathing, close and labored, from somewhere near the door. He called out, but his own voice echoed back at him. When he stepped outside, the air was alive with motion. A shadow darted near the woods, followed by the faint shape of the girl again, her pale dress gleaming in the dark. He ran toward her, shouting her name, though he didn't know why he called her Elsie, and that was when he smelled it, smoke. The cabin was burning before his eyes, flames licking up the wooden walls as if the structure itself had been waiting to ignite. He stumbled backward, shielding his face from the heat. The fire moved too fast, too deliberately, spreading through the roof with a roar. For a moment, he thought he saw figures moving inside, shapes caught between light and shadow, their faces blank, their eyes open. He heard whispers rising with the smoke, voices repeating the same phrase over and over, "Keep the blood whole." The blaze consumed everything within minutes. When it was finally over, the hollow was silent once more, the cabin reduced to a skeleton of glowing embers. Thomas stood in the ash until dawn, trembling, staring at the blackened ground where the house had stood. That was when he saw it, an opening revealed by the collapse, a narrow staircase leading downward, hidden beneath the floor all along. The earth beneath the cabin was hollow, waiting, and whatever was buried there had just been uncovered. When the investigators arrived 2 days later, the smoke had long since cleared, leaving behind the charred remains of the cabin and the faint smell of something far worse than wood. Thomas was the one who called it in, though his voice on the tape was strained and almost unrecognizable. He told them about the fire, about the graves, about the child he swore he saw. They dismissed most of it as shock, the ramblings of a man who had spent too many nights alone in the wilderness. But when the search team began digging through the ruins, their skepticism turned to silence. Beneath the ash and splintered beams, they found the staircase Thomas had described, leading into a space no one had known existed. The air down there was heavy, unmoving, and carried the unmistakable scent of decay that had been sealed away for years. The room was small, carved directly into the earth, its walls lined with stones blackened from age. At first, it seemed empty. Then, one of the men's flashlights caught something pale jutting from the dirt. When they began to dig, the ground gave way easily, revealing bones, small at first, then larger. They found not one body, but several, stacked and intertwined as though laid together intentionally. Some were old enough to have turned brittle, others disturbingly recent. The bones were strange, showing signs of deformity, curved spines, twisted limbs, jaws too narrow for the skulls they held. The forensic team later confirmed what the locals had whispered for generations: every set of remains carried the same genetic markers. It was one bloodline, circling endlessly back upon itself. Among the remains, they found traces of personal belongings, a child's shoe, a ribbon, fragments of fabric that had once been white. Near the center of the chamber was something different, a smaller skeleton, its hands folded neatly over its chest, its skull resting against another, adult-sized one, as if the two had been placed there together. The inscription carved into the wall above them was crude but clear enough to read, "To keep what is ours." The words were surrounded by scratched symbols matching those Thomas had seen inside the cabin. The investigators sealed off the site and classified it as a historical burial ground, but the locals refused to go near it. They said that after the fire, lights still flickered between the trees, and sometimes the sound of a girl's laughter echoed through the hollow. Thomas never returned to his job after that. He disappeared not long after the reports were filed, leaving behind only his field notes, the burned diary, and a final entry written in his own hand: "The hollow is alive." They never left.